The wind that night moved through the Texas flatlands like something lost, low and restless, brushing against dry grass and empty fence posts, carrying the kind of silence that only comes when the world has forgotten someone exists. Hank Calloway had been riding since before the sun went down. His horse, a steady brown mare named Rue, knew the trail home by memory, so Hank let his mind wander the way tired men do, thinking about nothing, thinking about everything. He was 53 years old, had worked this land since he was 19, and had learned long ago that the plains had a way of humbling you. You thought you'd seen everything out here. You thought there were no more surprises left. Then Rue stopped. She didn't slow down. She didn't hesitate. She just stopped. Completely still, the way horses do when something in the air doesn't belong. Hank straightened in the saddle. His hand moved instinctively to the lantern hanging from the horn. He raised it. The pale light reached maybe 8 feet ahead. Long grass, a broken wooden post, a burlap sack near the edge of the ditch. And then, so soft he almost convinced himself it was the wind. "Mama?" Hank Calloway was not a man who cried easily. His neighbors would tell you that. 3 decades of drought, debt, and personal loss had carved him into something lean and quiet. He'd buried a wife. He'd sold land that had been in his family for 4 generations. He'd kept going the way you do when there's nothing else to do but keep going. He grew up in a small ranching community outside Marfa, Texas, the kind of town where everyone knows your truck, your dog, and your business, usually in that order. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, raised by a father who believed hard work was its own kind of prayer. His mother had died when he was 11, and from that age forward, Hank had grown up understanding that the world didn't stop for grief. You carried it with you, or you left it on the side of the road. By all accounts, Hank was a simple man. He woke early, worked hard, ate quietly, and asked very little from the world around him. His small house sat on what remained of the Calloway land, about 40 acres, enough for a few cattle, and a garden that his late wife Clara had planted 12 years ago, and that he still tended every spring, though he couldn't fully explain why. He had no children. That had been the one wound that never quite closed. Clara had wanted them deeply. They had tried for years, and then life moved in a different direction, and eventually Clara's heart gave out one September morning, and Hank was left alone in a house that still smelled faintly of her coffee and her lavender soap. He had made peace with solitude, or so he believed. The night he stopped on that dark trail, everything he thought he understood about his own life was about to be turned over like dry soil before a rain. He climbed down from Rue slowly, the lantern swinging from his fist. The sack was tied at the top with a rough piece of twine. It was moving, barely, gently, the way a chest moves when someone is trying very hard to stay still. Hank knelt in the grass. His knees ached the way they always did in cold weather. He didn't think, he didn't calculate, he just pulled at the twine with his rough fingers and opened the sack. Inside was a baby girl. She couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, wrapped in a piece of faded flannel shirt, dark damp hair against a tiny forehead, eyes that blinked up at him, not crying now, just looking, as if she had spent whatever energy she had on that one word and had none left. Hank stared at her for a long moment. His lantern light caught her face. She was so small, so impossibly small against the darkness of that ditch, against the enormity of the night, against the vast nothing of the land stretching in all directions. He reached down and lifted her with both hands. She weighed almost nothing. She made a small sound, not a cry, more like a breath with texture, and turned her face towards the warmth of his chest. Something in Hank Calloway broke open right then, not violently, quietly, the way an old house settles in winter. He wrapped his coat around her, climbed back onto Rue with one arm holding her against him, and turned the horse towards home. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in Clara's old rocking chair by the wood stove, the baby against his chest, trying to remember the last time he'd held something this fragile. He fed her warm water with little sugar on a cloth corner, something he half remembered from watching a neighbor care for a sickly lamb years ago. And she took it, weakly at first, then with surprising determination. By morning, she was still alive. By morning, something had already shifted inside Hank that he didn't have words for yet. He drove into town that day with the baby wrapped in a clean flannel blanket placed carefully on the passenger seat of his truck. He went to the county sheriff's office first, the way a responsible man would. He filed the report. He described where he'd found her, what condition she was in. Deputy Reeves, a young man with a clipboard and a careful expression, told him the baby would need to go to the county social services office. There would be a process. She would be placed in the system. Hank nodded. He understood procedure. But when they asked him to hand her over at the desk, he stood there for a long moment with her in his arms, and he said, surprising himself, "Can I have a few days, just to make sure she's stable before you put her through all that?" There was a pause. Deputy Reeves looked at him, looked at the baby, looked back at him. "You know how to care for an infant, Hank." Hank didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'll learn." What followed was 3 weeks that Hank would later describe as the strangest and most exhausting of his life. He drove into town to the town pharmacy and stood in the baby aisle for 45 minutes, reading formula labels with his reading glasses pushed up on his nose. He called his neighbor, Edna Marsh, who had raised 5 children, and she came over that same evening and spent 2 hours showing him things. How to support the head, how to mix the formula, how to tell a hunger cry from a pain cry. Edna didn't ask too many questions. That was one of the things Hank had always appreciated about her. She just watched him with the baby for a while, and at the end of the evening, as she was pulling on her coat, she said quietly, "She looks at you like she trusts you already." Hank didn't respond, but after Edna left, he sat back down with the baby in the rocking chair, and he looked at her small face in the lamplight, and he thought about that. He named her after the trail where he found her, not the official county road name. There was a locust tree that grew sideways near that stretch of road, and locals had always called it the Locust Bend Path. He'd always just called it the bend in the road. He called her May. Not May from a book or a family name, just May. Short and strong and simple, like a sound the wind might make on a warm evening. May Calloway. He didn't decide it at once. It built the way most important decisions do, quietly underneath other thoughts, until one morning he woke up and realized the decision had already been made. The social services process moved slowly, the way such things often do. There were home visits, background checks, a caseworker named Mrs. Deborah O'Coffer, who drove out from the county seat 3 times in the first 2 months and walked through Hank's house with a clipboard and a professional expression that gave very little away. On her 3rd visit, Mrs. O'Coffer sat across from Hank at the kitchen table while May slept in the small wooden crib he had built in the corner of his bedroom. Mrs. O'Coffer looked at the house, clean, warm, the baby's bottles drying on a dish rack by the sink, a hand-drawn growth chart taped to the wall, a small pile of children's books beside the stove. She said, "Mr. Calloway, can I ask you something?" He said, "Go ahead." She said, "You're 53 years old, you live alone, and you're asking to adopt an infant. Most people in your position would have handed her off and moved on. Why are you doing this?" Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because she called out for her mama in the dark, and there was nobody there, and I was there, and I think that matters." Mrs. O'Coffer wrote something on her clipboard. She didn't show it to him. She came back 2 more times. Then she stopped coming with a clipboard and started coming with a casserole dish. 9 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in a county courthouse that smelled of old carpet and copy paper, a judge signed the paperwork that made May Calloway officially, legally, permanently his daughter. Edna Marsh was there. Deputy Reeves was there, off duty in a checked shirt. Mrs. O'Coffer was there, standing in the back of the room with her arms folded and a smile she was trying to keep professional. May was 10 months old by then. She sat on Hank's lap through the whole proceeding, chewing on the collar of his good flannel shirt, entirely unconcerned with the legal significance of the moment. When the judge said congratulations and offered his hand, Hank shook it. Then he looked down at May, who looked up at him with those dark eyes, and he said, very softly, just for her, "You're mine now. You've been mine since the beginning, but now everybody else knows it too." She grabbed his thumb. She held it with that grip that still surprised him sometimes, that certainty in such small hands. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light was wide and golden the way October light gets in that part of Texas. Hank stood on the front steps with May against his shoulder, and Edna took a photograph on her phone. A big man in a worn hat with a small girl looking out at the world from the safety of his arms. That photograph would sit on his mantle for the rest of his life. The years passed the way years do when you're paying attention, fast in memory, slow in the living. May grew up with red dirt on her boots and a vocabulary that mixed ranch language with the books Hank read to her every evening without exception. She could name every constellation visible from their porch by the time she was 6. She could ride Rue, who was getting old now, moving slower but still steady, by 7. She could fix a broken fence post by 8, working beside Hank with the same quiet focus he'd always brought to the land. She asked about her birth parents when she was 7. Hank had prepared for that conversation for years. He sat down with her at the kitchen table, and he told her the truth in words she could carry without being crushed by them. He told her she was found. He told her she was chosen. He told her that the word abandoned was a word for what other people did, not a word for who she was. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Were you scared when you found me?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I think I recognized you." She looked at him for a moment with that look she sometimes had, older than her years, steady and searching, and then she nodded as if that made complete sense. And she went back to her drawing, and the conversation was over, and somehow also never really over. She was 9 when Rue finally passed. Hank found the old mare lying in the far corner of the pasture one morning, peaceful like she'd just decided it was time. He stood there for a while with his hat in his hands. May found him there. She was small beside him, her hand in his, and they stood together in the early morning quiet. After a while, she said, "She was the one who stopped the night you found me." "That's right," Hank said. "Then she's a hero," May said simply. They buried Rue at the edge of the pasture and planted a locust tree over her, small and sideways, the same kind that grew at the bend in the road. When May was 12, something happened that Hank hadn't anticipated. A woman came to the house. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a dusty sedan, parked at the end of the drive, and sat there for nearly 10 minutes before getting out. Hank watched from the porch. He didn't know her. She was young, mid-30s maybe, thin in the way people get when life has been hard on them, with dark hair and eyes that, when she finally walked up the path, looked familiar in a way Hank couldn't immediately place. She said, "Mr. Calloway?" He said, "That's right." She said, "My name is Renee. I'm not sure how to do this." She stopped, looked at the house, looked back at him. "I think you have my daughter." The words landed like a stone in still water. Hank stood very still. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You'd better come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd had 100 quiet breakfasts with May, where he'd helped her with homework, where they'd played cards on rainy evenings. Now it held 2 cups of coffee and the most difficult silence Hank had ever sat in. Renee told her story in fragments, the way people tell the stories they're most ashamed of. She'd been 19 when May was born. She'd been alone.
The father had left. Her own family had turned their backs. She'd been in a place, mentally, physically, that she described only as very dark. She said she'd told herself the baby would be found. She'd left her near a road where she'd seen ranch lights in the distance. She said she'd been wrong. She said she'd known she was wrong every single day for 12 years. She'd gotten clean 4 years ago. She had a job, a small apartment, a therapist. She'd spent 2 years tracking down the legal records. She was not here, she said carefully, to take May away. She didn't have that right, and she understood that. But she needed May to know that she was not left because she wasn't loved. She'd been left because her mother had been lost, and that was the difference, and she needed May to know it. Hank listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself or the life he'd built. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She's at school right now. She gets home at 3:15. Renee looked up at him. "You can stay," he said, "if that's what you're asking." It was the hardest thing he'd ever offered. He knew it even as he said it. When May came home that afternoon and found a stranger sitting at the kitchen table across from her father, she stopped in the doorway with her backpack still on her shoulders and looked between them. Hank said, "Come sit down, May. There's someone I want you to meet." May sat. She looked at Renee. Renee looked at May. And in that moment, without any words yet, something passed between them, recognition, or the beginning of it. The complicated human thing that happens when two people see themselves reflected in each other without warning. Hank let them talk. He got up and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the pasture, at the small locust tree over Rue's grave, at the late afternoon light going golden across the land. He heard May ask in a quiet voice, "Why?" He heard Renee answer in a quieter one. He didn't catch all the words. He didn't need to. What he heard eventually was May crying. Not the sharp cry of anger, the long, releasing kind, the kind that means something that's been held too tightly for too long is finally being set down. And then, after a while, he heard Renee crying too. He stayed at the window for a long time. That day changed things, and it didn't change things. May was still his daughter. She would always be his daughter. The paperwork said so, and more than that, 12 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days said so in a language that no court needed to translate. But May began writing letters to Renee. Short at first, then longer, then occasional phone calls. Then, when May was 15, a visit, supervised in the loose, trusting way of people who have decided to trust each other, to the small apartment in the next city, where Renee had a vegetable garden on the balcony and a shelf of recovery books and a photograph of May as a baby, printed from a public records image pinned to the wall. May came home from that visit quieter than usual. She sat with Hank on the porch after dinner, the way they always did, and she looked out at the flat, dark line of the horizon, and she said, "Dad?" He said, "Yeah?" She said, "I don't think she's a bad person. I think she was a broken person. And I think those are different things." Hank thought about that. He thought about all the broken things he'd known in his life. The land after a drought, a fence after a storm, himself after Clara died. Things that looked finished but weren't. He said, "I think you're right." She leaned her head against his arm the way she had since she was small, and they sat together in the quiet, and the stars came out over the plains, slow at first, then all at once, the way they always did out here, the way the sky reminded you each night just how large the world was, and how small and how held you were inside it. May Calloway graduated high school at the top of her class. In her graduation speech, short, no notes, delivered with that steady voice that everyone who knew her recognized, she said, "The most important thing I know is that being found is not the same as being lucky. It's the same as being loved. And I was loved by a man who didn't have to stop, but did." She was looking at Hank when she said it. He was sitting in the third row, in his good flannel shirt, his hat on his knee, and when she said those words, he pressed his lips together and nodded once, the way he always did when emotion moved through him and he didn't have anywhere else to put it. Edna Marsh, sitting beside him, quietly handed him a tissue. He took it without comment. There is a particular kind of person the world doesn't always notice. They don't give speeches or make headlines. They don't post their kindness online or wait for someone to applaud. They move through the world doing what seems to them like simply the obvious thing, stopping when something calls out in the dark, staying when it would be easier to leave, giving what they have even when they don't know if they have enough. Hank Calloway was that kind of person. He would tell you he wasn't special. He would tell you that any decent person would have done the same. And maybe that's true. Maybe it is. But the question that lingers, the one that stays with you long after the story ends, is a simple one. When you hear something calling out in the dark, and you will, in your own life, in your own way, do you stop? Do you stay? Do you put your coat around it and carry it home? Because that is the whole story. Not the paperwork, not the courthouse, not even the years of small, ordinary days that built a life. The whole story is one man on a horse on a dark trail, and the sound of one small word, and the choice made in a single heartbeat to answer it. Some people come into your life in extraordinary ways, and sometimes you come into theirs, and sometimes the road bends in the dark, and you stop, and everything changes. For them, yes, but also quietly, irrevocably, for you. May Calloway knows who she is. She knows where she came from, not just from a burlap sack on a cold night, but from the arms of a man who chose her before he even knew her name, who built her a world out of 40 acres and a rocking chair and a lifetime of evening stars. And Hank Calloway knows something too. Something he couldn't have told you that night on the trail, but that he knows now in his bones, in the way you know things that took years to understand. He didn't find May in that ditch. She found him.